Exultet Gario.
Welcome back to another episode of the Heart Speaks to Heart podcast, a product of Three Hearts Homestead.
Today's episode is part 2 of our conversation on building community. If you missed the first half of our conversation, you can find it on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your podcasts.
You can also find us at threeheartshomestead.com for more episodes, blog posts, recipes, articles, and much more.
Previously, on Heart Speaks to Heart.
Because without love, that's what conflict resolution becomes. A way to exert one's own will, minimizing the negative consequences he can bring upon himself.
So, hearing kind of about, that there is conflict and knowing that conflict is always going to be a part at some point in a community's existence, why bother with the commitment and the time it takes and the pain that will inevitably, come and go when it comes to building that community or living within that community itself?
That is a very good question. Because it is difficult. It's one of the most difficult people. That's not English. Start over. It's one of the most difficult things that people can do is to form intentional bonds with other people, whether that's strengthening bonds in the family, strengthening bonds in the community. On the note of strengthening bonds in the family, I think it was someone I was listening to the other day that was saying it's not interesting why people leave, it's interesting why people stay. I can think of a million reasons why people would leave. What I really want to know is how you stayed with this person for over 50 years and it didn't drive you to the point of leaving. That's what's interesting. The stories of the people who stay is what's interesting. So why? What's the point of staying in a marriage? What's the point of staying in a family? What's the point of staying in a community? What's the point of trying to put in the time and the hours to make these things work? And there's probably some sociological answer that stays above the board in terms of secular principles about we'd all die if we were just islands unto ourselves because we only think we can provide everything for ourselves. We can't really do that. And that's true to an extent, but I think the much more interesting answer, the much more fascinating answer is that as Christians, we're just commanded to. It's part of our Christian life to believe that God has commanded us to live in communion with each other. Looking at Genesis, right, it is not good for the man to be alone. And from that, you see the first human relationship. That's where Adam and Eve, Adam receives Eve. Is not soon after God makes that very astute observation that it's not good for the man to be alone. And in receiving Eve, he is not only given Eve, but he's given the gift to form an entire family with children. So it's not good for him to be alone. It's not good for him to be alone only in regards to his wife, but in regards to his children. And you can branch out from that to all of society. It's not good for us to be isolated. And then you see that reinforced, obviously. Paul's letter to the Hebrews is one that comes to mind, right? Hebrews 10, 24 and 25. I briefly played around with the idea of reading the Latin out loud and then reading the vernacular out loud. And maybe one day I'll be confident. And well, that's what people used to do, right? Like back when people had scripture memorized and in Latin, they'd be like, oh, well, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, in this fancy language. And then they just immediately followed up with what it meant. But like, people did that with poetry. People did that with like, I mean, we still do that now with like things like quid pro quo or
That is true. I'm just not
the piece de resistance. Like, there are phrases that we have in other languages that we still just use in those languages for flair. And we used to be able to do that with scripture or with classical works. I remember a friend of mine was telling me that there was this author he was reading who was a soldier in Spain, somewhere before the Enlightenment era, and he just casually is quoting scripture like crazy in the Latin text that Jerome published, or not even scripture, but just classical works of literature. This author is talking about his experiences with these other people, and someone will just start reciting famous literature. And he just knows it from cover to cover.
That's amazing. Honestly, that's a skill that I feel like is kind of...
I think poetry is a good place to start. Poetry is generally, unless you're going for some epic poems, generally short enough that we can still keep it within our memories, even in our frail, modern attention spans. So I think scripture is a good place to start with particular verses, and then poetry is a good place to start when it comes to reclaiming kind of that memorization, recitation tradition. But anyway, Hebrews 10. We see down in verses 23, 24, and 25, actually just 24 and 25, right? And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and to good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Right? So Paul's commanding the Hebrews in that, like, we've got to get through this together if we're going to hold to the truth, right? This entire chapter is labeled, at least in my translation, a call to persevere. That's the heading over this part. And part of this perseverance that Paul's talking about is that we have to be able to stir each other up towards good works and towards love. And that means not neglecting to meet together, encouraging one another on a regular basis, and all the more so as we see the day of the Son of Man drawing near, the day of reckoning, the day of judgment. As we get closer to that eschatological horizon of God's coming, it's only going to become more important that we strengthen in these bonds of communion and community together. And I think he's basing that off the idea that, like, community is a very big part of the heavenly reality. You think about the people who are in heaven, the people who will be in heaven, and it's not implied that they're all off in these isolated little cells. They don't have these little cubicle cells in heaven where they just all experience heaven individually. That's not what's described in Revelation. And so we are trying to, right, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We're trying to bring about these heavenly realities on earth, to bring about the will of God. And that means entering into community with each other, encouraging each other, building ourselves up into these bigger things. And it's community is what it really boils down to.
Right. No, that makes sense. I think a lot of it has to do, too, with just what you were saying about it is not good for the man to be alone. Like, regardless of the way it is in heaven, like, in our fallen reality here on earth, we still can't get through life alone. Mm-hmm. Right, like we have to at some point interact with some other person or other people for different aspects of our existence, for different aspects of, nourishment, for different aspects of, the basics, like clothing. Like, I mean, we can't, any one of us, do everything on our own. Like, it's not possible. We were created that way for a reason, like you were saying, because the heavenly reality is that we're all in communion with each other and communion with God. We're all part of the body of Christ. And that reality is starkly apparent here on earth in the way we physically cannot get through life without interacting with others. And I think that's something else too, kind of like you were saying with, as the day of the Son of Man draws closer, like, a lot of people are feeling a need to return to a sense of community in some shape or form. Like, they're feeling this need to resurrect some of these goods, some of these ideas, some of these skills, some of these lifestyles that we've lost over the last 100 years with modern industrialization and just this way of life that is very isolating. Like, there's a push to that, I think, that speaks volumes to its importance, both just in general and especially in our times now of community. Which, kind of looking at that in a different way, like, there's, in addition to the push of needing community, there's also been very much a movement towards more agrarian living out of urbanized society, kind of a back to the land movement, if you will. How does that look in community if you are living in an urban setting or living that more agrarian lifestyle? Like, is there a way they can interact and be part of the same community? Should they have their own individual communities? Like, kind of, what are your thoughts on that and how that plays out in an ordered society?
That's actually a really good point. So, I see two movements. One is kind of the back to the land movement, which has been going on for a long time. You even see back right around before the Industrial Revolution really took off, and then into its fledgling years as well. I'm thinking around the times of the World Wars, as you were really seeing machines of war and industrial development of artillery and supplies for war, military, really starting to gear up. There were lots of people who saw what was coming down the pipe and were like, I don't want anything to do with this. We need to not have anything to do with this industrialized monster that we're creating. And that's a conversation for a different day. Industrialism isn't exactly the question that you asked, but people trying to get back to the land as a way of avoiding this cookie cutter assembly line style living that has kind of been embraced in the cities. And I think it's a beautiful thing, and I think we need to get back to it. And I think, obviously, as long as we think community is a good, especially as long as we think it's a scriptural command, then we need to be ready to implement community in the way that looks. There's another movement, though, that I see which is just as fascinating to me, even though it's not one that I feel called to. To kind of parallel the language of, like, back to the country, or back to the land, I guess I would call it kind of tongue-in-cheek back to the ghetto. This is what I'm seeing in communities that are forming in urban environments by lower-class families who are just trying to really embrace what it means to live together in the midst of what it means to be somewhere between middle class and poverty, living in these very compact neighborhoods, in these very compact suburban sprawls. Actually, they're trying to avoid the suburban sprawls, really. They're moving back into worse parts of cities because to them it makes more sense. It provides more of the infrastructure that you need to start a community than to stay in these suburbs without sidewalks and where no one actually knows their neighbors. And I think both of those are good movements. Obviously, the urban movement, the back to the ghetto movement, that the tongue-in-cheek about that, right, is that's not exactly what it is. If it was exactly what it is, that would sound like gentrification, which I do not support gentrification. That's not what I'm trying to get at here. It's largely a movement based upon people with approximately similar means and approximately similar qualities of life to what you'd already find there, just being deeply intentional about what it means to live together, what good communal infrastructure looks like, stuff of that nature.
To be able to, like, literally walk to see your friends and walk to church or walk to the store.
Yeah.
I think that's a lot of it with those that try and form community in more urban settings, is that there's very much a closeness that is demanded by proximity as well as intentionality. And I think that plays a big role in it. But, like, when it comes to agrarian living, when you don't necessarily have that option to live within walking distance anymore, because we're not a village set up like we used to be in the olden days where the church was within walking distance of the pasture lands and the farmlands, and that was just how community was made. How do we look at that now and have a share in that community, have a share in what it means to live in communion with somebody, with other families, with other people, when we can't practically live within that walking distance?
It's hard. It's hard because even if you're intentional about traveling decent distances to visit other people living this agricultural lifestyle, it requires a level of intentionality because it requires taking a break from your life in order to go do these things, basically. It's very hard to integrate that to such a degree that it no longer feels like you're taking a break from your life to go associate with other people. Mm-hmm. And if you're taking a break from your life, then you're not doing life together. So it is hard. I think that's why there is a prerogative when you are doing agricultural stuff together to be nearby to each other, whether that means it's a 10-minute drive or more or less than that. I think there's not a hard limit when you're just trying to get something going, when you're just trying to get any sense of community you can, because land's not infinitely available, right? You can't always live as close to people as you want to live with them. But if you do have some kind of distance, I think making sure that you're being intentional about making them a necessary part of your lives. Maybe you could buy your own piece of farm equipment that you only use once or twice a year because you can afford it. Or maybe you subject yourself to the dependence of relying on someone else that you want to enter into community with who has it, and working out some kind of a rent or a barter or some deal that allows you to work together in agreement to use their machinery, because that is a way that you will do life together with them. It's going to take sacrifice, the same way doing community in the city together is going to be sacrificed with everyone stepping on each other's toes. It's going to be a different kind of sacrifice, though, because you're not stepping on each other's toes. You have to almost force yourself to want to step on each other's toes, and you have to drive 10 minutes out of your way to go step on someone else's toes, because if you're not, then it's not really community if you're not stepping on someone's toes, right? That's...
Mm-hmm. I think there's a give and a take, though. Like, I think in addition to, like, relying on others, like, you also have to be someone that can be relied upon.
Yes.
In that relationship, whether it's with the neighbor who lives across the road from you and maybe has 100 acres of farmland and you only have 20 and you're raising livestock and they're doing crops. Like, I think there has to be a give and a take and a generosity there.
Generosity is fundamental to this. That's exactly the word that I was just thinking about, even. If you're trying to be stingy in community, then you're falling back into that mentality of using community for self-serving purposes. And that's going to have limits on how efficacious it can be. And it will not have supernatural virtue at its heart. I don't believe that. I'm not saying that with any kind of authority. Again, theologians with pitchforks.
Torches. All of the torches. Flaming torches.
We can talk about this one later, but yeah, you must be overabundantly and exuberantly generous with the people around you, with the people you're trying to enter into a relationship with, and that can be an act of trust in God that they'll respect that generosity, that they won't leave you high and dry and make life miserable for you. But I think that's a trust that we're asked to partake in.
Let me tell you about a new opportunity we are offering for our fans and supporters. You may know the podcast and the blog, but did you know that Three Hearts Homestead is on Locals? If you have ever wanted to engage with us online, chat with other fans of the homestead, or support us financially, this is a great way to do it. Sign up for free at threeheartshomestead.locals.com to see posts, updates, and content you won't be able to find anywhere else. A paid membership at any amount gets you access to additional perks, including the ability to write posts, see other people's comments, and access to live chat events and exclusive video content, like our monthly Q&A, where we take questions directly from our supporters. Sign up between now and the new year and get 1 month of free access to our exclusive content by using code word COMMUNITY for a free trial. That's threeheartshomestead.locals.com, code word COMMUNITY in all caps. Now, back to the show.
I agree. So, I feel like maybe we haven't touched on the interaction of the community super well.
Yeah.
Like, we've kind of talked about, what it looks like in an urban setting somewhat, and like what it looks like in a more agrarian setting somewhat. But like, is there room for those two differing lifestyles of community to come together and be a greater community within a town or a city or a county even?
Certainly. And I think a lot of it has to do with interdependence on each other. Trying to integrate your lives together in such a way that you become interdependent on each other. Not to the point where if like something terrible happened, you'd all be left high and dry and miserable and unable to survive. That's not the goal. That's not what we're asking for. That's not what we're looking for. But yeah, there are ways in which the city interacts with the country in ways. I mean, obviously, first and foremost, the city is always dependent on the country. I think the statistic is that should food supply get cut off immediately and drastically in pretty much any town, any city, anywhere, you've got 3 days of food, maybe, tops. So there's a constant interaction in socioeconomics of the country bringing food into the cities. And in that relationship, there is room for community to be built, for sure. And then likewise, you have dependency of the people in the country relying on the people in the city. And maybe this isn't the way it's always been. Maybe this is only a feature of the world that we live in now. But driving into town to get supplies for the farm, driving into town to go to church because there's not a church every 2 miles in the middle of the country, driving into town because that's where the trading is, and you might have everything that you want to sell, but selling it from your property is not getting it out into the public the way that it would be if you were at a local farmer's market instead. And getting to know your customers, getting to know the urban people who are buying your product and developing an actual relationship with them, who you rely on for money and they rely on for sustenance. These are all relationships that are necessary that community can enter into. I'm kind of just going back almost to the definition of community for just a second, right? It's fascinating. You can look at some of the anthropological research that's going into that word these days. There's a guy who I have not read hardly any of at all. I only hear other people talk about him, so it's like word of mouth by word of mouth, but he's interesting to me and I want to get to read him. I'm just not brainy enough in anthropological research. But his name is Victor Turner, and he does a lot of research in liminal spaces, which is kind of that, that threshold moment that I was talking about where things change, where change happens. And from that, he's developed this kind of idea of structure and anti-structure. He uses these words to describe human interaction, and structure is the hierarchy. It is the legal system. It is the power balance. It is the structures that we have in our world that govern how certain people interact with each other. Structures are what says that it's what governs the way a waiter will interact with someone going out to get dinner. This is your role, that is their role, this is the social structure that exists between you. Anti-structure is the one that I think is most fascinating, and he actually has a synonym for it. He describes anti-structure as communitas, the Latin word that has derived into the English word now, community, although its meaning was slightly different in the original Latin. And it's interesting because anti-structure is almost a contrary force to structure. Even though both of them are necessary for society, communitas, anti-structure, is spontaneous. It's what bonds people together. You can have all the structure in the world about, I want these people to get together and we're going to hang out and we're going to have a cookout and I'm going to provide this much food and the food is going to be served at this time and it's going to be very tasty and we are all going to sit down and enjoy it. They will leave the house by this time. They will arrive at the house by this time. These are the people who are going to be there. This is the pre-approved list of games that I have said that will be played in the yard. And that's great. You need that structure. That's a societal thing that anti-structure actually relies on and fits into. But that's not what causes the bonding. That's not the source of relationships between people. The anti-structure, the communitas, are those liminal spaces, those moments, those transitive things in between where you're just doing it together as a group. No amount of planning is going to ensure that people get along together. No amount of planning is going to ensure that people bond together over the thing that's being done, other than just mildly enjoying it. But the shared common denominator between things like rites of passage, between that feeling when you're at a concert and everyone else around you is cheering to the same music that you're listening to, when you've all gone through some trial or are working towards some mission and you're doing it together as a team to get those things done, when you're all working towards the same vision, those moments, which exist outside of structure and usually have a level of spontaneity to it that defies structure and breaks down structure just a little bit, because if all the proper hierarchies were being observed, some of these interactions would not always be happening. That's where bonds come from. That's where relationship and community, kind of enters into the human experience. I think that's fascinating. I really want to do more investigation into that at some point.
It is really cool and definitely fascinating. So, like, you're talking about structures a little bit, so, like, this question kind of springboards off of that. Like, what does a community do, or a person in a community do, if one of the integral players, maybe a longtime member, maybe the person that originally started the community itself, ultimately discerns at some point in time that they are being called to leave that community and go somewhere else? Like, how does the community function if integral people leave? Because obviously you've come to rely on these people, you've come to trust them, to care about them, all of these things. Like, is there a correct response, or is it something that just you accept with grace as God's will and move on?
You've got a couple responses. A couple things you can do. You can fall apart.
Let's not do that.
You can pretend that the hole's not there. And act as though it never existed. And that won't work. You'll fall apart if you do that. It needs to be addressed. Addressed properly. Honestly, what comes to mind there is how we handle loss. How we handle mourning. I compare it to the way, not to the same degree, obviously, but losing a loved one. How you contemplate loss, how you mourn properly, how you figure out what life looks like without them. There's less emotionally charged degrees of that in pretty much all human relationship, I would imagine, varying from practically non-existent to the relationships we have with our loved ones. When you have community leaders who depart for any number of reasons, maybe death is even one of them, it needs to be addressed. It needs to be something that is pondered with the correct amount of consideration, so as not to shut it up, not to bind a wound that hasn't been cleaned properly, because that won't work. That will fester, and that will turn into more disorder and more dysfunction later down the line.
It's not just overall collapse and destruction of the entirety.
Absolutely. So what does that mean, though? What does it mean to address things like that? Sometimes it means other people stepping up, taking on more responsibilities, understanding that there is now a need that was being filled that is no longer being filled. Some of it means understanding that no matter how much you do that, the identity of the group is fundamentally changed, because it is defined by the people who are there. You might have a group of 4 or 5 friends who are known for laughing all the time because the 5th friend was always telling good jokes. You can't be the group that laughs all the time if no one's telling the jokes anymore, and that's just a personality thing. If no one fills that hole, and no one should be obliged to think that they need to fill that hole of telling jokes and being good at it, then yeah, that'll change the way things look. That'll change the way that things are fundamentally in a very real, tangible way that you've got to be ready to move with, and you've got to be ready for that change to hit. It can break a group completely. It can put an end to anything that they have going if you're not careful, if you're not dedicated to the community. But that's also where you see the difference between people who are dedicated to other individuals and to people who are dedicated to the community as a whole. Right?
Right.
You see family members when they're dealing with the loss of a loved one. You can see the dedication they have to their family and to the members who remain because they don't allow the loss of the one to drive them away completely. Widows and widowers don't leave their children because their spouse died.
Well,
don't in the moral sense.
right.
Don't in the shouldn't.
Yeah. It's not that it's impossible, it's just that it is not the problem.
They should not, yes. Should not. And that really is a manifestation of the love that they have for the family as a structure. Or structure. That's kind of the wrong word there, because I just used a wildly different idea for structure. But family as a community, family as relationships. It's not all dependent upon any one individual and exists to a degree without them in a wounded state that needs to be given time to heal, but also time to understand what it is without the other people that were part of it. To kind of reevaluate who you are as a group of people and to figure out what that means, to work through that. And there will be people who fall away anytime one of an individual leaves a community because they were there for that person, or they just can't find it within themselves to make what that person brought to the table keep working through the other members, so they can't keep the memory living on. That can be the nail in the coffin. If that's what happens, and it does happen, you've got to get to work building another community. You've got to get to work finding another one to join. Don't allow yourself to become isolated.
I think that would be a similar question that would follow up to that. Is like, in the opposite sense, what do you do when people want to come into the community? Like, negating like somebody leaving, like not assuming that. Like, obviously people would come in if you're trying to build a new community, but like if you have an established community, but new people move in, new people want to become a part of it, new people want to dedicate themselves to that way of living, to that level of relationship with each other, what's the best approach to that too? Would it just, I mean, obviously it changes the fundamental.
Right. Let it happen organically. That's such a hippie thing to say. But let it happen organically. Let it grow on its own. Don't feel like you have to overly legislate the way that you bring new people in. Don't feel like you have to overly gatekeep who you allow to join. If it's not someone who's a perfect fit for the community and you realize that that might have been an imprudent decision, then you've brought someone closer to you who you need to be ministering to, who is not of maybe the same mindset as you were, but is of the group of people who you have wounds and divisions between that you need to keep healing and working on, and who you can be ministering to. Some of my friends from various places throughout my life have been people who I thought the same way about something as I did, and as the friendship progressed, I realized that maybe we didn't have as much in common as I thought we did. And the friendship didn't really blossom out of us having much in common. Our friendship blossomed out of our mutual trying to help each other through life and trying to understand each other. And really, more than anything else, trying to minister to each other. And obviously, the ways that I was ministering to them, I felt were right for various philosophical, theological reasons. And they probably thought trying to convince me of the things that I believed that they didn't believe. They probably thought that was for a good reason too, and only one of those was true, depending on the circumstance. But I think that's a big point. I think that's a big factor. I think that's important to remember and to keep in mind, is that maybe it recontextualizes things so that this person you've brought into the fold is now someone that you're trying to teach. This is someone you're trying to instruct. This is someone you're trying to form in the way that you've taken them under your wing, in a sense, when they're maybe not the best fit, as opposed to bringing someone in who is equal in stature as far as whatever ideals are kind of the foundation of the community. And that's fine, because we're all supposed to be ministering to each other anyways. It goes back to that idea of us and them, the other not really being a thing that exists. Everyone's just your cousin Bob.
But why Bob specifically?
I don't know. Because he doesn't like being called Robert.
Any other thoughts on community? Any other...
We could go on about this for a while, and we might have a part 2 on this at some point, because I feel like in my ramblings and some of the points you've brought up, there's probably plenty of things that need to get tied up later, things that need to be revisited, maybe with a little more linguistic precision. So we might have to keep that in mind. We might have to be ready to commit to this again at some point. But and we'll have a lot more perspective on this as the years go on, as people who have been living community a little more intentionally, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, developing more practical applications. But I would strongly encourage anyone who's looking for community, who's looking for not feeling so alone, to really just find people to do life with, really be ready to sacrifice things for the good of the other. Yeah, that's really the big one. Be ready to do life with people. Don't be passing ships in the night. That won't get you very far. That won't be very good.
Right. And be open to being humble and patient with conflicts as they arise, with struggles, with difficulties, because those virtues will also help you as you try and grow in community.
Yeah.
And get closer to people in relationship.
Yeah. I guess 2 final thoughts. If there's only 2 things you take away from this, I think it'd be these probably. Or at least anything that I've said. Obviously take away everything that my wife said. But
or don't. That would probably be better.
But yeah, 2 big takeaways. First, don't worry about being overly legalistic about what a community is, about how people join communities, about how people act within the communities, and what rights and responsibilities you give to people in the communities. That's all structure. That's not anti-structure. That's not communitas. That's not community in that sense of the word. And that'll be important. You need both of them. It'll develop on its own as you see the needs that are specific to the group that you're in. Maybe have a mind for that. Maybe keep some of that on the back burner as you're going through stuff, as you're going, well, it might be nice to have this one day, or it might be nice to have some kind of way of voting within the community to decide what big events we do together. But really the most important thing is just get in there, do life with other people, meet with them on at least a weekly basis. Don't let a week go without seeing these people. Don't let 3 days go without seeing these people if you can say anything about it. Maybe you can't. Maybe that's not where you are in life right now. But do your best to really live with these people. And then the second thing is just kind of a parting note. And we can get into this more. We will in the future when we talk more about the internet and about online things. We've got an episode on that coming down the pipe one day soon. So watch out for that in the future. But don't do community online. Just don't do it. There's good to it. There's good to online communication. There's good to social media. That good is greatly reduced compared to other goods. Specifically doing community in real life around each other. It's not enough that we choose given 2 good options. It's not enough that we just choose whichever one we want to do. There might have been a time when that was acceptable. I don't think there was, though, especially depending on what kind of philosophical tradition you belong to. But it's not enough to pick, oh, well, this is a good and this is a good, so I'm just going to do the good that I like. You need to do the greater good. You need to do the higher good. And if you've only got so much energy that you can expend in forming friendships, talking to people on a regular basis, keeping up to date with your life and what you're doing, expend that in the people who are going to share meals with you. Expend that on the people who are going to help you learn how to patch a hole in your roof, and who you're going to go over and help them learn how to change the oil in their cars because maybe they didn't learn how to do that. Expend that energy and time on the people who are in your church. Expend that energy and time on the people who are going to be eating the food that you grow. If you're in an agrarian society or if you're in an urban society, expend that on the people who might not have as many friends or might be more isolated because they live out in the country, who are put into your life because you're eating their food, because you want to support your local businesses. Put that effort there. I learned that lesson the hard way very recently, and Maddie, I'll let you weigh in on this, obviously, because this is much more of a side tangent than I expected to put into a parting comment, but we really will get into this in the next recording, so I probably won't go on too much more on this train of thought, but like, my goodness, do community with the people that are in your life around you. Online communities can be good. There are goods to them. They serve a purpose sometimes in certain places, but I used this analogy once and I stand by it. Having online communities is like daydreaming together mutually. It's not the same thing as living together. It's like daydreaming together because you're all taking breaks from your own lives to go to this virtual space to create lives together, talking to each other, but you're departing from your own lives to do that. You're not living together. You're not doing life with each other.
Right. I do think there is something to be said for the people that develop real-life friendships from online friendships. But I think the important thing is that, well, twofold. One, you don't stay in the online space in those friendships. Those friendships, if they're going to mean anything in terms of true community, they have to become a real friendship, a tangible friendship, a friendship where you physically see the person and interact with the person in your daily life, not just online, but two, that there is a prudence and a temperance enacted in your use of social platforms, of social interactions online in the online space, because it can easily become a time suck that takes away all of your time and energy from your life in front of you, from the people in front of you. And that's kind of where I think leave that for now.
Yeah, absolutely. If your friendships are being maintained online, then congratulations. Technology is holding your friendships hostage. And we'll leave that as a little teaser for the next episode. We'll get into that more.
How could you?
Tune in next time. I think we're talking about online ethics. That's a very prominent idea for people working in the blogosphere, kind of like we are, for people who are using the ease of the internet to connect with other people in the homesteading space and to kind of help get not only financial support, but community support, and really just getting educational materials out there for other people who are interested in entering into this lifestyle. It's a brilliant tool. It can be quite a blessing. It can also be used for immense evils.
A curse. It can be a curse.
It can be a curse. And we'll talk about that more next time. So if you've ever wanted to think about starting a blog, starting an online store, or if you are on the consumer side of these sorts of things where you listen to podcasts like this on a regular basis, or watch a lot of YouTube videos about how to do these sorts of things, and wonder why on earth you're watching YouTube videos about how to live off the grid, where you will presumably no longer be able to watch YouTube videos, that'll be a good episode for you, so stay tuned for that.
Until next time.
For more content from Maddie and myself, Be sure to visit our website at threeheartshomestead.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Pinterest, YouTube, and more by looking for Three Hearts Homestead. Lastly, be sure to check out our locals community at threeheartshomestead.locals.com for more exclusive content. And be sure to tune in for future conversations like this one between Maddie and I as heart speaks to heart. God bless, and have a good day.
Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sic ut erat in principio, et nunc et semper,